Hi all, today we're going to be talking a little bit about death investigations. In previous unit, you did something on the 7 S's of crime scene investigation, so keep those in mind. That's obviously what you do when you arrive at the scene. And I'll go over them just really quickly. First thing is secure the scene. Preserve life is obviously the top priority, and then scene safety, making sure it's safe for other first responders, and then preserving the evidence. Next thing to do is separate and question witnesses and victims. Next, scan the scene, look for evidence, exit entries, and make sure it's set up for investigators. See and observe the scene. That's really where you're going to take your photographs. Sketch the scene, create a drawing of the scene, and video as well. Search for scene, that's where you're really going to do a more detailed look for clues and or evidence. Oftentimes you'll find a lot of your trace evidence there. And then secure and collect. You're going to package and collect evidence and then maintain the flow of custody. When we're talking about death investigations, first we have to say when someone is dead, and that it sounds obvious, but it can be very controversial. In my live class, we actually researched the case of Terry Schiavo. That one became national headline news many years ago on whether she was dead or not. It's really an interesting case if you want to take a look at that. Death in forensic terms is someone is considered dead when there is irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory function. Coroner versus medical examiner, that does vary by state. In Colorado, we actually have both of those. In Colorado, to be a coroner, all you have to do is be 18, you get elected, and then you take a 40-hour death investigation course. That does not mean you get to do an autopsy. It just means you go to scenes and determine kind of the manner of death. And then if it does need an autopsy, you would refer it out to a medical examiner's office to do the autopsies. Colorado, you only need a doctor's degree to do an autopsy. Thankfully, in Colorado, most of our big counties have forensic pathologists. Again, the coroner system was established in England, and the requirements are elected official, registered to vote. In some states, you have to be a physician, but not in our state. And then anywhere an autopsy is done, you obviously have to have a medical degree. The medical examiner system was created in Boston in 1877, and the definition really varies by your location. Here's across the United States, some of the different systems. Staff at a medical examiner's office, obviously the person doing the autopsies is a physician or forensic pathologists, but they also have other staff. So if you're looking for a career field, I might be a death scene investigator if I had to do it over again. They also have autopsy assistants, and I'm not sure how to say that word. I think it's diners, but it could be DNers. Support staff, and then you also have death scene investigators. So when you go to a crime scene, the crime scene itself is run by the police department or the sheriff's department, and then the medical examiner's office or the coroner is in charge of the body. Death scene investigators from the medical examiner's office, they really kind of do a separate investigation. They're often former law enforcement or nurses, and sometimes they'll investigate when the police department doesn't. So say a suicide death, they're just going to ensure that it was a suicide. They usually go and question family members, where they kind of do the forensic psychology of all that. They're also the ones who, if it's an unidentified body, and we see sometimes that with our unhoused population, they're going to investigate and try to determine next of kin. To be a forensic pathologist, you need a bachelor's degree, medical school, pathology residency, pathology fellowship, and then you usually look at a specific form of pathology and board certification. With all that education, you obviously spend a lot of time in school. They are rare. They're in high demand. I think the ones in Colorado get paid about $400,000 to $500,000 a year. Who goes to the medical examiner's office? Anyone who suffers from a violent death, and that does include car accidents. Car accidents are investigated. A lot of our safety in cars has come from autopsies. Suspicious or unusual deaths, any death in custody, unexpected and occurring during a therapeutic procedure. So say you were getting a nose job, right? You would then go, if you died during that, you would go to the medical examiner's office. A threat to public health. And then if you're unattended by a physician during a fatal illness, if seen within the last 90 days, sometimes that can change. But sometimes if you haven't been to the doctor's office in a while, even if you have a fatal illness like cancer, sometimes they'll still do one. And that varies a little bit by locale. I'll give a personal experience. My mom found her friend's body a year ago in her apartment. She was on the couch. My mom called law enforcement. Law enforcement called the medical examiner's office. The medical examiner's office actually had access to her physician's visits, and she had a history of heart disease and liver disease. So they did not take her in for an autopsy. They actually just said, okay, handle it. And so my mom had to notify family and figure out which funeral home to call. So most of us will live very long, healthy lives and die of natural causes. The most common cause is cardiac death or cardiovascular disease. Here's some of the leading underlying causes of death in the United States: heart disease, cancer, and unintentional injury. So that would be an accidental death. For example, we had a firefighter in Denver who was longboarding and fell off his longboard and just hit his head wrong and died. Stroke, chronic lower respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's diseases. Alzheimer's isn't what kills you, or dementia. What it does is it actually slows down sometimes your ability to swallow, or if you live alone, you're not hungry. So there can be some other mechanisms of death in that. Diabetes, kidney disease, chronic liver disease, and cirrhosis, and then COVID-19. I think the height of COVID deaths was 21 and 22. And there were so many COVID deaths that it actually reduced. Most of us used to live into our late 70s and early 80s, and those years decreased by a couple due to COVID. We also have a lot of drug and alcohol deaths, especially if you live in Denver. I think El Paso County has quite a few too. But just fentanyl, heroin deaths are decreasing. We don't really have a full accurate amount number on how many people are addicted or dying from that, because Narcan is also increased. So the more people that are carrying Narcan, whether it's your EMTs, your police officers, or even the Denver Public Library has a Narcan. So even if the numbers have decreased, sometimes that data can be a little bit skewed. Again, in a live class, we go ahead and do that. Medico-legal examination. The reason we do that is it aids in the prosecution of criminal activity if it's a suspicious death, protects public health, and it can also aid in civil justice. So for example, I had a student whose dad had died doing construction, and so sometimes the autopsy report will be used in that. The investigation, determine the manner, cause, and mechanism of death. Also to ID the person, estimate the time of death, collect evidence, document injuries and how they occurred, and provide expert testimony if needed, and then also determine what disease killed them. Now we're going to talk about manner, cause, and mechanism. Manner of death is a classification of death based on the circumstances, and think about what are the 5 manners of death. The first one is homicide. Next one, suicide, natural, accidental, and then undetermined. I want to go back real quick. Okay, well, let me go back. When we talk about homicide, homicide is the taking of life by another. Homicide can be either felonious, which is then it's called murder against the law, or non-felonious. So, for example, if you are driving the speed limit and you're not under the influence and a kid is to run out in front of your car and you hit him or her and kill them, it's still considered a homicide in most jurisdictions, but obviously it's not felonious. Same thing with self-defense. Cause of death is the injury or disease that is responsible for death, such as a gunshot wound, a stabbing, or a COVID. And then the mechanism of death is what I call kind of the medical terminology for exactly what happened to your body. So if you're thinking about this, guess the manner and cause. I'll give you a minute. She died, obviously, by homicide, asphyxia by strangulation associated with a craniocerebral trauma. She was hit in the head first, and then she was asphyxiated by strangulation. Mac Miller, that was ruled accidental, mixed drug toxicity. Drug overdoses can be tricky sometimes because sometimes they're suicidal and sometimes they're accidental. So that's really where you have to do kind of that forensic background of the person in order to correctly determine that, and that's what a death investigator in the medical office would also do. That's important for insurance reasons. Most insurances don't pay out if it's a suicide, and that was actually the case with Heath Ledger. Kobe Bryant, that was an accident, blunt force trauma. Robin Williams, suicide, hanging, and then asphyxia, and I actually spelled asphyxia wrong there, my apologies. Jenny Rivera, accident, and the cause was actually undetermined on that. They could not tell. Paul Walker, that was considered an accident, and he died of traumatic and thermal injuries. They actually found soot in his trachea, and so they know he was alive after the car accident. Rosa Parks, that was natural. She had progressive dementia. Dementia causes death by impacting vital bodily functions such as swallowing, breathing, and heart rate. Oh, I did have this slide. Homicide is the taking of a life by another. Murder is the legal term. Homicide. So in Colorado, there are different ways that you can be charged with homicide or murder. We have first-degree murder, and there's different ways that you can actually be charged with first-degree murder. One is obviously after deliberation, where you think about it. Also, if you give drugs to someone on school grounds and they die from that, that's actually considered first-degree murder as well. There's universal malice, and that's kind of a catch-all. We also have second-degree, reckless, and manslaughter. Okay, I've mentioned this before, but in the investigation, the police run the scene and the medical examiner's office investigate the body and run a parallel investigation. Investigating a death scene, what you really want to look for is the where, who, what, and when. Where is the scene located? Who is it? And then what and when did this happen? The body. Obviously, you do not want to move or alter the body in any way unless it's a safety issue or attempts to save the life. By not moving it, that helps preserve trace evidence. You would place hands in a paper bag. That is so you can tell gunshot residue, especially if it looks like, if you can't decide between homicide and suicide. And then you place it in a transport bag. The other thing for bags in the hand is also think of a sexual assault. There might, or any crime, there might be DNA under the fingernails of that victim. The other thing we're going to talk about is TOD, or time of death, and PMI, post-mortem interval. If you've watched Grey's Anatomy, you always see them with that, the time of death is. Well, if it's in the hospital, then we do have the exact time. If it's unwitnessed, the death is actually reported as the found time, and then we try to do a range of when the person died. I did want to point out that when we're talking about the time of death, um, there are some ways we can do it, but it's a range. You're going to find a range when the person died. You're never going to be able to say, like on some of the CSI shows, they died between 12:30 and 12:45. Decomposition. There is a chemical process which, with the body, breaks down. It starts off as fresh, then it gets bloated, and this is if a body is left outside. If it's in water or buried, it could look a little different. Active decay, advanced decay, and then dry remains. This is also impacted a lot by temperatures. That's why body farms, the first one was obviously in Tennessee, which most of us have heard about. That is a very humid area. So we actually have one in Colorado at Western State. There's one in Texas, and there's probably a few others. Those are the three that I'm well aware of. Very different climates. I'm going to skip that one. Putrefaction, the process or decay of rotting in a body. Decomposition, autolysis and putrefaction are the two stages of chemical decomposition. Now we're going to get a little bit more to time of death. Livor mortis, think of the color of a liver. It's kind of a purpley red. And what happens is, upon death, the pooling of the blood begins in your body. So the blood is going to go to the lowest part of your body. It starts within about 30 minutes. It's fixed between 8 and 12 hours. Contact pallor occurs when the vessels are compressed. When I say fixed, it means it doesn't change. So if you move the body, you can often tell. So for example, if you find a body and it's got this coloring on its back, but they're lying on their stomach, then you can tell that that body had been moved. I think those are pronounced tardy spots. This occurs in the advanced stage of livor mortis and is due to burst capillaries. Sometimes you'll see these in the eyes or in the face, and that could also be a sign of strangulation. They do tend to be a little bit more red in color. Carbon monoxide versus livor mortis. Carbon monoxide, if it's more of a cherry red lividity, it's probably carbon monoxide. Traditional livor mortis is more of a dark purple. These white areas are results of they were pressing against something at the time of death. Rigor mortis, think of the term rigid. It begins about 2 hours after death in the head. It starts in the small muscles, the head, and then goes to the larger muscles. It maximizes around 12 hours and then decreases and is usually gone after 24 hours. It can be highly dependent on the temperature as well. Also, the size of the person, clothing, stuff like that. One of the ways they try to determine when JonBenét Ramsey died is when her dad brought her up from the basement. Her hands were over her head when he was carrying her. So she was in the full stages of rigor mortis, and that was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Algor mortis, cooling of the body after death. Body tries to maintain homeostasis after death for 1 hour, and then it loses approximately 1.4 degrees until it reaches ambient temperature, or temperature of wherever it's at. But this is also dependent on weather, exposure, and environment, and a person's natural temperature. During the height of COVID, when we were all getting our temperatures taken everywhere, there was some research in doctor's office that showed that 98.6 or 98.4, it's actually starting to decrease a little bit. If you go to a scene and you're a death investigator, you're going to take the room temperature, note any fans, and then if it's outside, record whether in full sun or shade. Really, the only way to do this, though, is to take a liver temperature, and very, very, very rarely would you take a liver temperature at the scene. Other things to be aware of when we're trying to determine time of death: insect activity. I could do a whole unit on that, but it's forensic entomology. Within about an hour of an animal or human being left outside, blowflies will be attracted to it. Blowflies will look for orifices in the body to lay eggs, and then there's a 21-day cycle in 71-degree temperature of when eggs turn into adult blowflies. If it's hotter, that occurs much quicker. And I actually was at, I did a neck research conference years ago, and we set out a pig. Pigs are used because they decompose very close to humans. It was about 100 degrees that week, and we put it out Monday, and by Friday, most of the skin tissue and fat and stuff from that pig was actually gone. Bloating is another thing to look for. Odors of death. They're doing a lot of research in that right now. Animal activity. If a body is left outside, animals will take away parts of the body. Skeletonization and mummification. We see that a little bit more in dry, hot climates like Arizona, and then saponification as well. That's more of a waxy substance that can occur. And again, if you do go to a scene and there's insects, you collect insects on and around the body. Some are preserved in alcohol, and then others are reared to adulthood to really try to get the cycle down. Generally, blowflies are the first to colonize a body. You also must document temperatures at the scene. Time of death, it's not like TV. It's really more difficult to determine, and it's pretty unreliable. It can give you a good estimate. What are other ways that are not scientific to determine time of death? So there's cell phone activity. We are creatures of habit and kind of glued to our cell phones. So when was it last used? When did they last pick up their mail? That and newspapers are getting a little outdated because a lot of us don't have mailboxes outside our house or get newspapers anymore. What food is in their stomach? When did they last make food or buy that food? Jonathan A. Ramsey had pineapple in her stomach, and so that became a big part of the Ramsey case as well. Security systems, if they have a ring camera, when were they last seen coming into their house? Work IDs, when did they last log into work? Receipts that might be in their car that shows activities. And then neighbors. Most neighborhoods have kind of the people who stay home and don't have much else to do besides watch their other neighbors. So do a canvas as well if you need to. Hopefully that was helpful. It was. Please just email me if you have any questions, and thanks for watching my presentation.